Communist regimes are inherently violent. Now, this is another classic one. The argument goes, well, if you look at how they rose to power, there was a lot of war and violent oppression. Look, if you are trying to take power through some type of popular uprising, do you really think the establishment is just going to step aside peacefully and say, fair enough, you guys have a turn? No. Just after the Russian Revolution, 10 plus capitalist nations joined together to invade Russia and put an end to the Soviet experiment. Then, for the rest of its history, it had to gear up for wars and protect itself from counter-revolution. In Cuba, the US constantly undermined the revolutionary government through terror and economic sanctions to cut them off from the global community. The CIA in South America has continually aided and funded fascist dictatorships to overthrow and undermine socialist movements in countries trying desperately to provide some basic social services. Or so US corporations could make a killing exploiting their resources and workforces. Read some Chomsky. Communist regimes are not inherently violent. They exist in a capitalist world and are constantly under attack. They survive under a siege mentality in order to defend themselves from direct invasion or covert attacks funded by deep state capitalist agencies. Communism won't work because capitalism is just the most efficient economic system. Now, this one is always thrown around like it's some unbreakable law of the universe. But who sat there and decided that capitalism is just the most efficient system? People with money, perhaps? Here's a brief list of some very commonly accepted inefficiencies of capitalism. Pharmaceutical companies often prioritize the development of drugs that promise high profits, like lifestyle drugs or treatments for conditions, rather than curing ailments. It would be more efficient to cure sickness, but not more profitable. Just look at the rampant use of antibiotics and the health crisis this is unleashing on humanity. The fashion industry prioritizes quick turnover of trendy, disposable clothing through a concentration on overproduction and market saturation, which creates considerable waste. Is this really the most efficient way of making clothing, or just money spinning? The car industry has been slow to transition to more sustainable technologies despite clear consumer demands for less environmentally damaging products. Efficiency or profitability? A substantial amount of the food we produce never reaches consumers' plates and ends up as waste, while children around the world starve. But let's just ignore that feeding people is the point of food production for a second. Food waste not only represents a lost economic value, but also contributes to environmental issues like compounding landfill needs and carbon emissions. Today, corporations prioritize protecting intellectual property rights through patents, which dramatically hinders the sharing of knowledge, slowing down scientific and technological progress. This actually limits humanity's potential. Is that efficiency? In many cases, advancements in science and tech have no upfront monetary appeal, and so they don't even register as important. In communist countries, people are poor and not free. Now, this one is funny because it's a direct result of Hollywood propaganda. Let's take the poor angle. Information collected by the World Bank in the 1980s about quality of life was compiled into a comparison of socialist versus capitalist countries who are at the same stage of development. The evidence showed that people living in socialist countries had a better quality of life. For example, socialist countries had a higher daily per capita calorie supply as a percentage, typically 12 to 15% more, than their capitalist counterparts. They also had higher life expectancy, lower child mortality, and more doctors and nurses per person. Now, people like to correlate education with poverty, so let's consider that then. In both the Soviet Union and Cuba, education levels soared after the revolution. The Soviet Union's literacy rate went from 32% pre-revolution to nearly 100% in the 1950s, and Cuba achieved near universal literacy after the revolution. The Soviet Union also made substantial investments in higher education, producing a highly educated workforce with a focus on technical and scientific fields. Basically, Russia went from a mostly peasant society to a space-age society in 40 years thanks to education. What about freedom? In the Soviet Union, immediately after its inception, all women were granted the right to vote from the age of 18, like all men, which was well before the most advanced capitalist nations. In the early Soviet Union, homosexuality was decriminalized, decades before the same freedom was granted in places like the US, UK, and Germany. On the contrary to the typical myth, communist countries are not poorer and are generally more liberated from conservative attitudes thanks to the initial enthusiasm. The modern world is too complex for communism to work. Now this one sounds convincing, but it's based on nothing. The 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed remarkable technological advancements that can easily help complex decision-making required to run global supply chains. With advances in information technology, data analytics, and AI, it is feasible to create sophisticated planning mechanisms beyond just a reliance on the invisible hand of the market, which, might I add, regularly and spectacularly crashes economies. The interconnectedness of the modern world actually presents opportunities for international cooperation. A global approach to resource allocation can fix challenges arising from local disparities. It is no surprise to anyone that in times of crisis, communal values prove to be resilient and adaptable. In the face of natural disasters from fires, floods, and earthquakes to managing a global disease outbreak, collective responses to crises are needed to offer real solutions to the problems, demonstrating the true potential for collective thinking. You have been programmed to hate communism, but for the most part, we don't even know what it is or what it could be. Remember, I am, you are, we are a MysterE.